I thought I owned 5 quiet acres of untouched land outside the city, my peaceful escape from the madness of suburbia. I even put up a no trespassing sign just to keep things clear. But one weekend, I drove out there and nearly crashed. My car. There were construction crews, heavy machinery, and freshly poured foundations everywhere. At first I assumed someone made a mistake, but when I asked what was going on, the foreman casually said, "We're ahead of schedule. HOA wants these 100 homes up by spring." What HOA? This wasn't just a misunderstanding, this was a full-on land grab, and I wasn't about to stay quiet. Before I tell you how I fought back, and what I found buried in the paperwork, make sure to subscribe if you love wild HOA stories like this one. For the past 4 years, I had this little slice of heaven, just outside the city. 5 acres of peaceful, untouched land. I bought it after saving for years, and finally closing the deal through a private seller who was offloading some family inheritance. It wasn't much to look at, mostly brush, trees, and a small dirt trail leading to a flat open space. But it was mine. My plan was to slowly turn it into a getaway spot, maybe a cabin someday. For now, it was just a quiet escape. I'd visit on weekends, bring a camp chair, a thermos of coffee, and sit under the trees. That land gave me peace I couldn't get anywhere else. No sirens, no neighbors. Just quiet. So, when I pulled up one Saturday morning in late February and saw a bulldozer barreling through where my folding chair usually sat, I literally froze. I thought I had taken a wrong turn. There were construction trucks everywhere, workers in safety vests, piles of lumber, rebar, porta potties, even a food truck parked to the side like this was some kind of operation. I parked my truck off the side of the trail and walked right into the mess, trying to figure out what I was even looking at. A man in a white hard hat looked up from a clipboard. "You need something?" he asked, wiping sweat off his brow. "Yeah," I said, still trying to wrap my head around it. "What is this?" He looked at me like I was the one who didn't belong. "Subdivision. Phase 1. Should be about 100 units, give or take. We just poured foundation for lots 1 through 10 yesterday. You with permitting?" I told him no, I owned this land. This was my property. He chuckled like I'd told a joke. "If you say so, man. Look, I'm just following orders. You'll want to talk to the HOA board. They're managing the expansion." I left that site in shock, drove to the edge of the lot, opened up the folder where I kept all my paperwork in the glove compartment. Survey maps, deed copy, purchase records, nothing looked off. It was the same 5 acres I'd always had. There was no HOA listed, no community development clause, nothing. I called the county office. They were closed for the weekend. I called the seller, but the number was disconnected. Figures. So I drove back the next day, Sunday, and by then a whole row of cement mixers were lined up. It was like someone hit fast forward on my land and turned it into a Home Depot parking lot overnight. I spoke to another worker. He didn't even hesitate. HOA's called Ridge Pine Estates. They've got the deed. They've got the... What? That night, I barely slept. I was flipping through every piece of paper I had. My name was on the deed. My name was on the county tax website. My address matched everything. How the hell was some HOA claiming my land? Monday morning, I was at the county recorder's office at 8:01 a.m., waiting for them to unlock the doors. I showed the clerk my paperwork and asked for the full property history. She printed it out, and there it was. 2 months ago, a new entry had been added. A community development overlay had been filed on the entire block, including my 5 acres, what's worse. It listed Ridge Pine Estates HOA as the managing body for the entire area. I felt sick. I asked her how something like that could even happen without me signing off. She just said, "You'll need a lawyer." Didn't have a lawyer. I wasn't rich. I didn't even have a mortgage. I paid cash for the land, but I wasn't going to let 100 cookie-cutter houses get stamped onto my peace and quiet without a fight. I drove to the Ridge Pine Estates office, which was ironically only 10 minutes away, right behind a row of townhomes I'd never even noticed. The office was inside a building that looked more like a dentist's clinic than an HOA headquarters. I asked to speak to someone about my land. The receptionist told me to wait. 10 minutes later, a woman came out wearing a business suit and a tight smile. "Hi, I'm Candace, HOA president. How can I help you?" I told her my name. Her smile didn't even flinch. "Oh yes," she said like she'd been expecting me. "That parcel's part of our Phase 2 development. Everything's been approved." I asked her how they got approval. For land I owned. She gave me this rehearsed line about easements, zoning overlays, and undisclosed community covenants. Said it had all been filed and reviewed. "You really should have received a notice in the mail," she added. "We sent certified copies last December. I never got anything. Nothing. Not a single envelope. No email. No call. No knock." But by the time I left that office, one thing was clear. They weren't backing down. They believed they had a right to my land, and they were already building on it like they'd won. What they didn't know was I wasn't going down easy. I left that HOA office with my hands shaking and a knot in my chest. I felt like I had just stepped out of some kind of bureaucratic twilight zone. How could someone point at your land, sign a few papers, and suddenly you don't own it anymore? The worst part? That smug little line Candace gave me, "It's all been approved." Like I was just some inconvenience slowing down their suburban empire building. I knew I needed legal help, fast. But I also knew how expensive it could get. I started by going online and researching everything I could about zoning overlays, annexation, and HOA expansion laws in my state. I must have read through 100 different legal threads and articles, and one thing kept popping up. HOAs can't annex private land without consent. Period. That was my opening. So I made copies of everything. My deed, the county parcel maps, tax records, and set up a meeting with a real estate attorney the next morning. His name was Frank. Older guy, kind of looked like a mix between a retired cowboy and a librarian. He took one look at the documents and frowned. "You didn't sell. You didn't sign anything. You didn't give consent," he said, flipping through the zoning overlay Ridgepine Estates had filed. "So unless there's some forged paperwork floating around, this is illegal as hell." Exactly what I needed to hear. Frank filed a cease and desist letter that same day, demanding an immediate stop to all construction activity on my land. He also sent a request to the county for every document tied to that zoning overlay. He wanted to see who filed it, who signed it, and how it got approved in the first place. Meanwhile, I drove back out to the property. They hadn't stopped. In fact, they had added 3 more crews. Concrete was getting poured, and wooden framing was already going up. I tried talking to the same foreman from last time, and he just said, "We haven't gotten any legal notice. We're moving ahead until we hear otherwise." The pace was unbelievable. It was like they were trying to finish before anyone could stop them. By Friday, Frank called me back with some disturbing news. "You're not going to like this," he said. The overlay had technically been approved through a loophole. A community-wide annexation request had been filed by Ridgepine's development partner, a company called Pinestone Development Group, under the claim that all affected landowners had been notified and consented by default. They used an obscure statute from the 1990s, buried under layers of zoning law, that said if no written objection is filed within a certain number of days, consent is assumed. The problem? I never got any notice. Frank raised his voice. "It's dirty, but it's not uncommon. These developers work fast and hope no one notices until it's too late. I wasn't going to let that happen. We filed an emergency injunction the next morning. It would force all work on the site to pause until a judge could look at the case. In the meantime, I started doing some digging of my own. I wanted to know who Pinestone Development Group really was. Turns out, they were the ones bankrolling Ridgepine Estates from the start. But what really raised my eyebrows was this. The CEO of Pinestone? Greg Alton. Name didn't mean much to me at first, until I went back to the Ridgepine HOA website and saw that same name listed as a consultant to the HOA board. Let me break that down. The guy funding the development was also consulting the same HOA that filed for control over my land. That wasn't just shady. That was a direct conflict of interest. I brought this to Frank. He just shook his head and said, "This is deeper than just some zoning mix-up. They've got a system." A week passed, then 2. We finally got our day in court. Just a preliminary, hearing to argue for a full injunction. Ridgepine's lawyer showed up with a mountain of paperwork, claiming they followed all legal protocols. But when the judge asked for proof that I had received notice, they couldn't produce a signed delivery receipt. Not one. All they had was a line that said, "Notice mailed, December 14th. The judge ordered an immediate halt to all development on the contested land. Everything on my 5 acres was frozen. No trucks, no workers. Not even a porta-potty could be moved. It was a small win, but it felt massive. I drove out to the site the next day and watched the bulldozers just sitting there like dead dinosaurs. Still, I knew it wasn't over. Because now Ridgepine had a reason to fight back. That same evening, I got a letter, hand-delivered, to my front door. It was from Candace and the Ridgepine HOA board. It said I was in violation of community cooperation agreements, and that my refusal to allow development was causing unnecessary delays and financial losses. They were threatening to countersue me. That's when I realized something. This wasn't just about my land anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been quietly steamrolled by an HOA, lied to by developers, or buried under legalese until they gave up. I wasn't backing down. Not now. Not when I had the evidence, the truth, and a judge finally listening. But what we uncovered next, buried deep in county records, would flip this whole thing on its head. Just when I thought things couldn't get more surreal, Frank called me one morning, sounding excited. That wasn't like him. Usually he was dry and methodical, lawyer stuff. But today, he practically barked through the phone. "I need you to come to the office, now." I drove straight there, heart racing the whole way. When I walked in, he already had a file pulled up on his laptop and copies printed across his desk. Frank didn't waste time. "We pulled the internal development filings from the county planning board," he said. "Some of it didn't match what Ridgepine submitted to the court." "Didn't match how?" Frank turned his monitor toward me. "Take a look at this." On the screen was a scanned document. It was titled, "Final Plat Approval, Ridgepine Phase 2. Pretty standard. But right there on page 3, under Parcel Inclusion List, was something insane. My land, my parcel number, had a signature next to it. A signature under the "Consent Acknowledged by Owner" line. But it wasn't mine. It was a total forgery. The name was spelled right, sure. But the signature looked nothing like mine. Not even close. Frank already had a handwriting analyst, ready to testify if this went to court. "That's felony-level fraud," he said. "And it wasn't just you. I found 5 other parcels with signatures that don't match public records. So this wasn't just shady paperwork. This was deliberate criminal falsification. And the best part? One of the forged signatures was supposedly witnessed by Greg Alton himself, the developer/consultant pulling the strings. We had his name in the witness column on a legal document tied to forgery. Now we had something bigger than a lawsuit. We had leverage. Frank filed a criminal complaint with the district attorney that same day. And just like that, everything changed. The following week was chaos. First, the local news got wind of the story. Someone at the courthouse must have tipped them off, because I suddenly had reporters calling my phone and vans parked outside the Ridgepine HOA office. A segment aired on the nightly news titled, "Homeowner Says Land Was Stolen for Subdivision. Forgery Allegations Emerge." Within 48 hours, everything froze again. Not just construction on my land, but the entire Ridgepine Phase 2 development. Contractors walked off the job. Banks pulled funding. Permits were under review. And then it happened. Greg Alton, this smug, invisible puppet master, resigned from the Ridgepine HOA for personal reasons, but not before the DA's office officially confirmed they were investigating forged documents tied to property theft. That's when Candace, the HOA president, came crawling back. She emailed Frank asking for a private meeting to resolve the issue without dragging the HOA into more trouble. That was her mistake, because Frank wasn't interested in saving their face. He wanted them exposed. Still, we agreed to the meeting. We wanted to see just how desperate they were. Candace showed up in a pencil skirt and fake confidence. Her lawyer looked like he hadn't slept in days. They tried offering me a settlement package. They'd restore my land, clean it up, and give me $50,000 for the inconvenience. I didn't even blink. No deal, I said. You're giving me my land back with a written apology, and you're reporting every fraudulent signature you filed. Her face went white. She glanced at her lawyer, who mumbled something about negotiating terms. Frank leaned in. The terms are simple. You undo the damage, or we file a civil lawsuit, then a class action, then take it public. Candace looked like she was going to be sick. And that's when I knew we'd won. 3 weeks later, Ridgepine formally withdrew their development claim on my land. They sent the county a letter rescinding the overlay, and the county confirmed the parcel was independently owned with no active HOA oversight. Crews came back to clear out the half-finished foundations, remove the framing, haul off the porta-potties, and flatten the ground. The land looked scarred, but it was mine again. I stood out there that weekend, coffee in hand, same as I used, too. Except this time I wasn't just a guy looking for peace and quiet. I was the guy who beat an HOA at their own dirty game. The DA's investigation was still ongoing. From what I heard, charges were likely coming. Against Greg Alton, possibly. Even against Candace and a few Ridgepine board members. I wasn't the only landowner they tried to steamroll. Once the story broke, more people started coming forward. Turns out, they'd been pulling this scam in multiple counties, filing overlays, assuming silence meant consent, forging a few signatures, here and there to speed things up. Not anymore. I got a call a few days later from one of the neighbors in Ridgepine, an older man named Jerry who'd been in the community since before the HOA existed. He told me, "You did more than just save your land. You exposed a whole machine." He was right, because this wasn't just about bulldozers and paperwork. It was about standing up when someone tries to erase you with a form and a fake signature. It was about fighting back against the people who count on you being too overwhelmed or too quiet to stop them. Well, they messed with the wrong guy. So if you ever get a letter in the mail with weird zoning talk, don't throw it away. Don't assume they can't take what's yours just because you know it's yours. Because sometimes, that's exactly what they're counting on. And if you ever have to fight back, just remember, one voice is louder than 100 cookie-cutter homes.